Good to go. So let me just welcome everybody back now. We shortened the break slightly just so that we can progress things. To be honest, when we normally have face-to-face conferences, they overrun much more than 10 minutes. So I'm quite happy to stay on track, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It's busy for everyone, and we're spending a lot of time in front of screens, so I know that is tiring itself. So without further ado, let's move on to the next session. I have to remember to look at camera. The next session, which really starts talking about the victim support framework. And the reason that we have this is because it has often been thought that victim support is about an organization helping victims. And what we have wanted to do over these last years is really start describing a much bigger conceptual framework, which reflects on the fact that support is everyone's job. So we have developed, I don't know if there's a diagram that's going to come up, but we have developed a diagram or a visual aid on what the victim support framework actually looks like. And at the heart of this framework is the victim themselves, and developing resilience and strength and advocacy, and surrounding that is the social support network of victims. But then beyond that, we have the organizations which are specialized in delivering support for victims. These are generic services, as we call them. These are organizations that serve all victims of crime. And Dame Helen Reeves pointed out the importance of having organizations which work for all victims without any discrimination, so that none fall through the gaps. But then there are also organizations which specialize in terms of working with specific groups, and they are just as important and just as necessary. But what we can't forget is that there are many other kinds of organizations and individuals who interact with victims, whether in the justice sector, law enforcement, health sector, social services, and the private sector are just some of the examples of different sectors who have a role in delivering support. So it's all of these organizations and sectors together actually form part of the framework. But at the very top of all of this is really an oversight and monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that are in place. And what we have seen as Victim Support Europe is that the countries which have entities, independent entities like Ombudsman, like commissioners, and which have ministers who are responsible for victims' issues, which have policy units in place for victims' issues, they are the ones that are the most progressive and continue to progress on victims' rights throughout the many years. And all of this is founded on a wide range of standards, which we also set out. So over the next afternoon and tomorrow, we'll be looking at some of this framework, and starting right now, we'll be talking about these independent bodies. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome three very good friends, people who've been working for victims for many, many decades now together, and have worked as commissioners and ombudsmen. So I will very briefly welcome them. I won't go through their bios as I've done for others, because I want to give them a chance to speak. We have a nice dialogue that we'll have. First of all, we have Judith Thompson, who's the former Commissioner for Victims and Survivors of the Conflict in Northern Ireland. We also have Sue O'Sullivan, who is the current chair of the International Network Supporting Victims of Terrorism and Mass Violence, but she's also the former Federal Ombudsman for Victims in Canada. And finally, we have Michael O'Connell, who is the former Commissioner of Victims' Rights in South Australia. So first of all, what I will do is I'll hand over to Judith first, and then to Sue, just to give us 2 or 3 minutes each, telling us about their particular role as commissioners and ombudsmen in their countries, before I hand over to Michael, who'll talk about his role as a commissioner, but also give a better framework and understanding of what commissioners are. And then we'll have different questions and answers from all of them, just to hear about some of the key concepts and issues when it comes to establishing commissioners and making the role of a commissioner or ombudsman successful. So first of all, over to you, Judith. Thank you.
Thank you, Lev, and it's really great to be here with you and everybody else this afternoon. So the role which I occupied for 5 years until September 2000 fits, I think, really well, Lev, into that oversight and monitoring and review level within the schematic that you're considering. And at the outset, it's really important that when you think about that oversight level, that it should not ever overlap with what the different NGOs and sector organisations do, because that would be conflict of interest and undermine the role, really. So the role I occupied was set in legislation. Again, I think a very important thing to have in place. And that legislation was specific to victims and survivors of the Troubles, of conflict in Northern Ireland. I think, as people probably are aware, that conflict lasted from a long time, from 1969 to 1998. Very long-lasting violent conflict in a small place. And the commission, of which I was commissioner, did research just a couple of years ago, which showed that 1 in 4 people living in Northern Ireland are still, or have a family member still affected by their experiences during that conflict. So a significant social issue. But in terms of the role and the legislation, I think there's great read across into what you're looking at here. So I'm just going to run through the main planks, I think, of that legislation, and reflect on how I think they show strengths and maybe sometimes potential weaknesses of this kind of role. Firstly, the role was very clearly about raising awareness of victims' needs at a societal level, a very public-facing role, and I believe that's right. I think it is important that this is seen as important to society as a whole and not a niche issue, because it is a core part, I think, of society. To review law and practice and to be the primary place of advice to government, that I think is absolutely critical. Obviously, the role is advisory, and I will come back to that a bit. I think they are inevitably advisory roles, but having that public face as well enables you to put some pressure on and to make very public statements about what you would advise government to do in the interests of all victims and survivors. In relation to that advisory role also, my particular role did not have the ability to investigate or to compel evidence. Now, other victims, similar roles do, and I believe that actually is a weakness in relation to the role I was in. The next part of it was to review the adequacy and effectiveness of services. Now, for me, that's about workforce development and standards, not about training. I think that training is often delivered by NGOs in the sector and by other partners, but actually to have a framework for competence to practice and a strategy for funding, for funding people's development to develop that workforce. And then finally, in my case, that legislation asked me to, or compelled me to bring together a forum of victims for consultation, which again, I found incredibly useful. There are often different types of experiences of victimization across different people. There are often different views and experiences. Everyone has their own needs and views. And to find your way through that as a policy advisor, it is so valuable to have people with that lived experience, but also, and this is important, the resilience to have the conversation and the competence to see it from a policy point of view, to bring those people together and to get them to advise me collectively on what was the best way through quite difficult policy areas. I found that incredibly empowering, and I think so did they. It was very important to have that victim's voice at the centre of policy. So in conclusion, because I know time is short here, and although I'd love to talk more, I don't want to take other people's space up. I do think there are a couple of paradoxes at the centre of what was my role, and I think many of these roles. The first is that, you know, legislators will create these roles to highlight at a strategic level the importance of victims' issues, but the person in that role has to be able to challenge government as well. Really important, that. So there is a paradox between you being in a role that is created by government and in a position where it is your job to challenge them sometimes. And they need to empower that role properly to do that. Otherwise, you have a strategic presence with no impact. And the other bit is about the appointments. My role, like many of those roles, you are appointed, you're a political appointee. Again, your appointment and your reappointment is in the hands of those who it may also be your job to challenge. That's, I think, a possibly inevitable challenge, but it does bring a paradox to the role as well. So Lev, thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, Judith. We'll come back to more, I think, later on. I'll now hand over to Sue O'Sullivan, who's the former Ombudsman, Federal Ombudsman for Victims in Canada. Thank you, Sue.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity, Lev. And I just want to, while I have a chance, to congratulate Lev on his to Zhao for his leadership as president over the years. So I just wanted to make sure I said that. I've been asked just very briefly, like Judy, if you saw me smiling at a lot of the comments that Judith made, because I'm definitely concurring with them. For those who don't know me, I'm from Canada. And so I've been asked to say a few words about the Office for the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime in Canada. And that office was created in 2007. And its intent, obviously, was to create an organization that would operate independently and yet hold the government accountable for its responsibilities to victims. So I had the privilege of holding that position from 2010 to 2017. And the position of Ombudsman in Canada reports directly to the Minister of Justice. And so we are independent. And I'll go to Judith's paradox. Yes, you will challenge the minister and the government for not meeting those and hold them accountable. But one of the benefits to our office is we did not have to report through the Department of Justice. In other words, we didn't have to seek any approvals from the department for our day-to-day operations, for our communications, or our general work. And I would say that's a key piece. So in Canada, the mandate for the federal Ombudsman, if you're not aware, in Canada, we have provinces and territories. So the majority of actual victim services that are provided to victims in Canada are done at the provincial and territorial level. So this position was exclusively to federal jurisdiction. However, having said that, we worked closely with victims across the country and with provinces and just respected the different mandates between them. And so the mandate of the office, and Judith, when you went down raising awareness, advice to governments, same thing, to promote access to victims, to federal programs, to address complaints for victims. Now, because the office dealt with federal issues, the majority or large portion of our complaints would come in relation to federal agencies such as the Parole Board of Canada or Correctional Service Canada. And so we wanted to promote awareness and obviously set the principles set out in the basic statement of basic principles of justice for victims of crime. Now, I'll speak just very briefly about something that happened in 2015, which is huge for Canada. But one of the other pieces of our mandate was to identify and review emerging and systemic issues, including those issues related to programs and services. So basically, we could help victims of crime in Canada individually and collectively. And obviously, as an office, where we take complaints and where we work with not just victims, victim-serving agencies, different organizations, day to day, we really had an opportunity to listen. And I'll talk about some of the other tools that were available to us. But it'll be no surprise to anyone in this call that the majority of recommendations that came from our office obviously come directly from victims, from listening to them and hearing them. And so we did have some tools available to us. One is that how we would tell Canadians how we were doing is we put together an annual report every year, and we're required to submit that annual report to the minister. And so the minister is then required to table that in Parliament. Now, some of the frustrations that would come over the years, not unique to my term as Ombudsman, is that there was often extensive delays in the minister tabling that report. And we could not release the report publicly until such time it had been tabled in Parliament. And that received some, through the media, through the rest of that, in terms of some of those delays. The other thing that we're able to do is a systemic review. So during my term, we conducted 2 systemic reviews, and that relates directly back to the mandate about the part about identifying and emerging and systemic issues. So we did one with the huge issues around the financial support to victims attending parole hearings, and the other was in relation to a federal income support for parents of murdered and missing children's grant that was not being used really at all. And then one of the things I want to talk about, though, very briefly is in the role as Ombudsman, and I think it's the same as what we do internationally here, Lev. I look at everybody's on here and have the privilege of knowing a lot of them, but we wanted to make sure, I mean, we're a very large geographic country. We have a lot of remote areas. We have huge Indigenous communities. And so one of the things we created was a national framework for engagement and dialogue. And obviously we were a small office, but we wanted to, so we made sure that we had a network and that we had relationships with key organizations, victim advocates that would respond. So in other words, if I was working with the Native Women's Association, let's say, they have the trust and respect. They are the door to the unheard. And so we would engage with with victim advocates, with victims, with organizations that already had that established networks of trust, and that we could then hear from the unheard through them, or they could organize and bring people into us. The other thing I just want to say is that just before we left, and when I say the team, because very much this office was based on the pillars of obviously taking complaints, basic service, of research, best practice, lesson learned, but also of communications, internal and external. And so we did a national engagement process to bring people together. I would also have the privilege of going to communities throughout Canada and listening, national symposiums, obviously the media, social media, but also meeting with the minister, but not just the minister, with the critics from the other parties in Canada. And the message was the same to all of them. So in other words, when people wanted to know what the issues and priorities were for victims, that message was the same to all of them. And obviously one of the biggest changes in Canada came in place in 2015 with the introduction and with the coming into force of the Canadian Victim Bill of Rights. And I will say that our office and our team, and basically, sorry, my fire alarm, it'll be done in a sec. One of the things that the office, I can go to mute. It's just telling me it's a test, monthly test. You're lucky you missed the first 3 minutes. I just want to finish up by saying this, is that it will stop in a sec. I apologize. Well, maybe I'll just go to Michael and I'll add some of that after, but I do want to say this, same as Judith, we have no legislative power to conduct investigations. Our mandate is federal, obviously the services provided at the territorial. And the other change that came in with the Bill of Rights, which if anybody is interested, the current Ombudsman has done an excellent report on talking about some of the changes that need to happen with the CVBR. One is that it changed the people that victims had to come direct, couldn't come directly to our office. They now have to go to the federal department first with a complaint, and then if they're not satisfied, to the office. And so I will stop there because I know my time is up. But I do want to say this. I think one of the biggest things we've learned, not just from having the oversight, and I'm going to go back to your framework, Lev. It is so important that their oversight and holding people accountable and challenging people, as Judith says, not just about strategy, it's about actually making sure that they meet what they say they will in terms of the commitments to victims of crime.
Thank you, Sue. I suspect that even if there was a fire, you'd still be doing the presentation whilst running down the stairs.
23 floors, not at my age.
Michael, let me hand over to you now. Maybe just spend a couple of minutes talking about the role of Commissioner over in South Australia, and then I think you have a long experience as a commissioner, but also you have a strong academic background, and you've been looking at different aspects of what it is to be at some kind of an independent body. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you think are the key roles, the framework, the legal framework. What are the types of issues and challenges which the role faces? And I'll bring Sue and Judith in with some specific examples as you go through that. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit here because of the time, and I'm just going to show you a PowerPoint very quickly. So I was the Commissioner for Victims' Rights in South Australia from 2006 until 2018. But prior to that, I held the role of the Victims of Crime Coordinator. Now, why do I make that point? Well, it's an important point about the role that an independent person can play, or possibly, and certainly my view, should play. So the original Victims of Crime Coordinator only had the function of marshalling, in other words, advising the government on how best to use its resources to assist victims of crime. And secondly, to carry out functions that were assigned by the Attorney General. In other words, despite being an independent official appointed by the Governor of the state, the Queen's representative in our system, the Attorney General could not only direct, but also assign functions to the then Victims of Crime Coordinator. When we had a change of government and the Office of the Commissioner was created, a decision was made to make the Commissioner more independent. And so at least on paper, and this point follows on from the paradox that Judith mentioned and the point of independence that Sue mentioned, at least on paper, the Commissioner for Victims' Rights in South Australia is appointed by the Governor, albeit on the recommendation of the government of the day. The government of the day's term is for 4 years, whereas the term for the Commissioner is 5 years. The idea behind that being is the Commissioner should not be fearful of challenging the government of the day in terms of any policy or practice or other that it might introduce or put forward. The Commissioner, just very quickly, assists victims in their dealings. Now, that one of the interesting points about this is that what does the word assist mean? Currently around Australia, the other commissioners for victims' rights can only assist victims of crime in their particular jurisdiction, whereas the Commissioner in South Australia was able to assist citizens of South Australia who became victims of crime no matter where they were in the world. And so, for example, I assisted a family when a lady was killed in a terrorist incident in London. I dealt with a complaint against police in Denmark and elsewhere. So the sort of geopolitical boundaries that impede some commissioners were not as relevant in terms of that impediment to the Commissioner in South Australia. Commissioner had a role, same as Judith and Sue, of monitoring and reviewing that legacy of carrying out functions as assigned by the Attorney General carried over. However, in terms of independence, another clause in the legislation says that the Attorney General cannot direct the Commissioner to do any particular function that is inconsistent with the objects of the Act. And should the Attorney General, that is the Minister for Justice, direct the Commissioner to do something, then the direction must be published in Government Gazette and tabled in both their Houses of Parliament. In other words, to demonstrate that the Minister for Justice has interfered with the independence of the Commissioner. The Commissioner could also make submissions in any proceedings, in other words, could appear either in person or through legal counsel in criminal proceedings, which is very unusual for adversarial systems, not quite as unusual in the civil inquisitorial systems that exist, for example, in Germany or in France, or to a certain level in some of the other countries. And finally, the Commissioner could also consult, not actually conduct an independent inquiry, but consult a public official or a public agency in relation to a victim's grievance. And if the Commissioner determined that there had been a violation of the Declaration governing treatment of victims of crime, then recommend that an official policy, a written apology be given. Now, there is an argument that that last provision is a step towards enforceable rights. But one of the interesting things in terms of the debate about all the commissioners or ombudsmen around the world is that often the legislation that they operate under describes the principles of justice, not necessarily the rights of victims of crime. And that, in terms of the law, is important because a right creates an entitlement, but it also creates an obligation. And where a right is violated or removed, there ought to be some form of remedy. And very rarely are there forms of remedy available to assist people. So,
Michael, can I just quickly, I'm just thinking of one of the points you mentioned. Oh, okay. I'll let you end, and then I'm going to quickly ask a question of Judith on one of the points you raised.
Yes. So, I think that now's a good point to have more of a discussion. So
let me just pick up on one of your points around sort of challenging government involvement in legislation. And I want to ask Judith, because it's a particularly difficult, sensitive environment, and I think it may have been quite difficult for victims of the Troubles to be heard. What do you think? How do you think being an independent commissioner made a difference? Did it open doors that others didn't have, couldn't open doors to? Were you able to engage with victims themselves in a way that maybe government couldn't engage? Did you create a bridge, do you think, in that role? I'm just curious to see what you felt was the difference as a commissioner over there.
I think the role does open doors, and perhaps particularly with government. I certainly was able to access parliamentary committees at United Kingdom level, in Northern Ireland's government, and also outside, and particularly with the Republic of Ireland's government, who have an explicit role in relation to some of our legacy issues. So it certainly helped with access, it helped with independence, and it helped I think at its core, and this was the most challenging thing, but the most important, it helped that it was somebody's job, somebody independent's job, to look at a very divided and politically nuanced area of practice and say, this is what is in the best interests of the greatest number of people harmed. And this is not a political view. This is not something which plays to one narrative or another. That is not something which will benefit one set of actors or another. In the context of the kind of conflict we'd experienced, which is still the fault line that runs through our society here, that was incredibly challenging, but also incredibly important, and one reason why we need that role. I do think that reads across, Lev, and I think we've heard that from Sue and Michael as well, into difficult civic issues. Sue talked about Indigenous communities and the difference between federal and regional. I think that's one thing about these roles. They stand back from those divisions. They look for a way through that should always transcend the political and the factional.
Thank you, Judith. Sorry, we've got fireworks going on around here. Michael, over to you.
I also believe that what the legislation says is part of the solution, but also the personality and the manner of the person who's appointed to do the job, because often some of those functions, for example, appearing before a royal commission or a parliamentary inquiry, where within the sorts of political systems that all three of us come from, because we've all inherited the British system of ministerial responsibility and so on, and that, you know, to step to one side and actually in an inquiry say to the people who are conducting the inquiry, what the government is doing is not to the benefit of victims of crime. It might be populist. It might be something that wins them a few extra votes, but it might not be what ultimately is going to improve the outcomes for victims of crime. That takes some courage, and given that these are limited term positions, one often has to look over one shoulder and weigh up to what extent are you prepared to be courageous and at the same time run the prospect of becoming unemployed or not reappointed. So I think that's an important thing, and it does revisit the paradox that Judith mentioned, and the very point that Sue made about, and on one hand, you are reporting direct to parliaments or bypassing other public officials, but you also have this sort of almost like a burden that does, unless you're prepared to take a risk, engage you with
So let me just ask Sue then. I just want to pick up on 2 points. I think that the personality issue, but also the legal framework and protection issue. But Sue, in your opinion, what helped you to have the success you had as a commissioner within Canada? And also, I'm particularly interested to hear about your thoughts on the coordination and bringing people together, because I got to know you through your engagements at the international level, which I think isn't necessarily what all commissioners do, but it had a strong influence in European conferences, for example, and then I see it in multiple other ways. So what did you feel what really helped you from that legal framework? Michael mentioned the 4-year, 5-year difference, but then also in terms of what you felt as personally was important as a federal ombudsman.
I think it's being able to create frameworks that allow you to have that engagement and dialogue. And those frameworks, you asked the question to Judith about what the independence, and you are there for victims. And you will build these frameworks because you will have to establish some trust and relationship. with not just the victims, but with organizations. And you do that by listening, by active listening, by providing yourself opportunities. And as I always said, I don't tell a victim story. What I do is amplify their voice at the different opportunities that are given to me. And so you will build that through the team that you have and through the opportunities that you create. And it is also about access and accessibility. And so any victim that contacted our office, whether they were in our mandate or not, we got them where they needed to go. And so that's an important piece, to know that you're there and you are a door in for them. Even if you have to redirect them, you'll know where to redirect them to. And so I think relationship is important. I think the independence is critical. And I know I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to just, if you don't mind, Lev, I'll finish with a few comments because I know you need to wrap up. But I don't think there is a more important time than right now to have oversight and to have independent, to hold people accountable, because one of the number one issues that is out there right now is public trust and confidence in criminal justice systems, in their ability to meet the needs of victims. And the other is maybe I'll quote Lev Eltan. Victims are essential partners on public safety, and they need to be considered equal partners and be at the table, not someone that just, well, it's nice to hear from you, whatever. They are equal and essential partners in keeping our communities healthy and safe. And we need to ensure that their voice is at the table. We all of us on this call never do a conference without starting with a victim's voice. So Marquetta, thank you, because it's the power of their voice that drives change. And they have the ability to influence change. And by giving them those platforms, the other thing I didn't mention is, I think I testified at over 30 different parliamentary committees on different pieces of legislation in Canada. And that's why, and that requires a lot of work in a team to help prepare that, because a lot of victims or victim organizations don't have the capacities. And so by creating those networks and those, I call them on purpose, a framework for engagement and dialogue, because at the end of the day, consultation sometimes carries with it legal parameters in our country. So it's just about giving them and using the different tools and thinking about how you can give them that access and accessibility. And the other is I'll just finish with this, because I know we could all talk for a lot more because we're passionate about this. I'm going to go back to your framework, Lev, because at the end of the day, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about this framework. You can have all the supports in place, you can have all the other pieces in place, but if you don't have these independent entities that are holding governments accountable for meeting their needs and their responsibilities to victims and driving that and helping drive that change and input, then I think we have to look back and ensure that that's in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. We're going to wrap up, but I just wanted to give both Judith and Michael 1 minute each. What do you think makes a good commissioner? Do you have any advice for those who are coming into the role, for governments that are thinking of creating it? Judith first.
Yeah, my first point would be you must be independent. Don't care who pays your wages. Don't care who who may seem to have power in a situation. Your focus is victims and survivors. You must be independent, guided primarily and always by their best interests, and never forced by government or any other party actually to follow a different course from that. In that context, it's all about relationships. Relationships with victims right across the piece, different experiences, different people, relationships with the organizations that provide support to victims, relationships with the government parties and those you must challenge. Because when you challenge those people, you will test those relationships every time. But if you don't have them, your challenge will not succeed. So it's all about relationships. Communicate all the time with every one of those levels. And finally, as Michael and Sue have both said, you must be brave. You must be honest about what is achievable and about what is not. And you must always be independent.
Thank you so much, Judith. Michael, you've got the last 2 words.
Thank you. So when the Minister for Justice came to tell me that I had been appointed as the Commissioner, he began with, I thought you were meant to be a voice for victims for these last 5 years that you have been the Victims of Crime Coordinator. And I said to him, well, I have been. And he said, well, why do we not hear your voice? I said, well, I advise the government and the Parliament on different things. And he said, you are now a spokesperson, as Sue put it, someone to amplify the voices of victims of crime. We have adopted a policy that victims should not be bystanders. They will continue to be bystanders until you make them heard. Get out there and make them heard. So that was his challenge. So I say that there is some ease in at least beginning the role of independent person if you have that political will and support. Mind you, it disappears pretty quickly as soon as you start to criticise them. The other 2 pointers I will make is you cannot mend all the harm that has been done to people. You cannot also be everything to everyone. And the final point is that sometimes as the independent person, or at least in my experience, I found myself having to advocate a perspective that I didn't necessarily concur with or agree with. But you have to be willing to not sacrifice your underlying values, for example, my opposition to the death penalty, but at the same time, you are there to be a voice for victims, and that does require sometimes some conciliation, but other times it does actually require you to stand up and voice some views that aren't necessarily yours. And I think that word of amplification that both Judith and Sue use is really important. Victims want a voice, they want voice recognition, and they want to know that people have heard their voice, especially where a decision affects them. And you become the conduit for that purpose.
Love, can I just say thank you to Victim Support Europe? I just want to everyone on this call, and I have had the privilege of meeting a lot of you. Thank you for what you do day in, day out to make a difference for so many. Thank you to Victim Support Europe for your leadership. I continue, it's like the gift that keeps giving, our relationship and our network. I have the privilege of being part of Victim Support Asia as well. To everyone on this call, thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much, Suze. Thank you to all three of you. I think relationships, courage, these are important points that we all have to take. Courage not only on the side of the commissioners and ombudsman themselves, but courage on the side of the governments as well, because there are plenty of governments we know who don't want to have people challenging them and don't want to accept that civil society is part of our modern democracy, that independent oversight is part of our modern democracy. So I think it's important to recognise that there are governments who are willing to accept that kind of scrutiny as well. So thank you to the three of you so much. I think both Judith and Michael will be coming into the networking breakout room as well. Sue, I know you have a very busy schedule despite being retired. I think you're busier than ever. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks to all three of you. And we will now move over to our next session, slightly overrunning, but I think it was worth taking the extra time. So we're now moving on to looking at the role of the victims' social support network. This is really friends, family, community, as well as the victim themselves. And I have the absolute pleasure to introduce Joan Dean from the Advocates for Victims of Homicide Association over in Ireland. She's been a staunch supporter of victims and sadly was a victim herself. And she has experienced the reality of the trial process, and it was as a result of this that she set up the organisation. So I'm going to now immediately hand over to Joan. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liv, and good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Okay, so in times of trouble, we turn to our family and our certain close friends for support. We turn to them in times of joy. We share our joy with family and friends, but especially so in times of trouble. And when we become a victim of crime, it is the family and our close friends who rally around to comfort and support us. And I think regardless of the nature of the crime or the severity of the crime, no matter how minor it is, it's a violation. And as such, it can be very difficult for us to process. During those times, the love and support of our family and our close friends is a very important factor in helping us to get through the shock and the trauma, and it can make the difference between us being able to move forward and regain our equilibrium and us not being able to move forward at all. And generally, that level of support is sufficient to see us through when a crime is not, at the more serious end of the spectrum. However, when the crime we have become victim of is more serious, such as maybe rape or murder, we're in a very different position, and our need for support becomes much more acute. And I can speak to that from my own experience following the murder of my son in 2003. The trauma experienced following a homicide is very complex, and certainly the loss of a loved one in such a violent way is extremely damaging. And it can seriously damage our ability to understand what has happened to us. It can shatter our entire sense of security and indeed our capacity to cope. There is the suddenness of the loss of our loved one, in addition to having to come to terms with the manner in which our loved one died. People who are bereaved by homicide experience intense, overwhelming emotional and psychological distress for a very long period of time. They are at greater risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder, and the likelihood of experiencing PTSD symptoms increases for those people who don't engage with counselling or psychotherapy. As I said, I can speak from my personal experience when my son Russell was murdered in 2003. That feeling of being wrapped in the love of my family and friends certainly was balm at a time of total chaos. I remember feeling like I was in the eye of a tornado that might at any minute spin me right out of my body, and at times even right out of the universe. The constant love and support of those closest to me was an essential anchor during that time. It is also true that the response from neighbours and the wider community, even people I didn't know at all, was something I never expected. And really it was that goodness that I felt surrounded by that gave me comfort at that awful time. In my case, losing my beloved son was so profoundly catastrophic and overwhelming, and everything about it was so far outside my experience that I had no terms of reference and no idea of how to be. I felt and still feel that loss in every cell of my body. On top of that, having to engage with police, the coroner, and all other aspects of the criminal justice system was a terrifying prospect to me, and having to cope with all of that at a time when I felt at my weakest was certainly extremely stressful. Family and friends can support and help, as they did in my case, but of course, they themselves are feeling and experiencing and trying to cope with the exact same trauma. And how can we expect to be fully supported by people who are themselves traumatized? Each family member and those close to the victim are trying to make sense of the trauma, but the horrific details of what has happened to their loved one is so traumatizing for everyone concerned that the ability to support can be too much of a burden. Everyone is feeling a myriad of emotions, including shock, anger, loss, shame, fear, and anxiety. And I remember being very conscious of this, and that I shouldn't expect the family and close friends to continue to support me when they needed that support themselves. And it was this realization that led me to seek help from what was then Victim Support in Ireland, where I met other families who'd been bereaved by homicide. I personally found the support from strangers who themselves had either been through or were currently going through the same trauma to be very helpful. And I suppose through a sense of shared experience, a great collegiality and solidarity was formed. The importance of peer-to-peer support should not be underestimated. To be able to connect with someone who has experienced the same trauma was hugely important to me and was a big factor in helping me to understand what journeying through the criminal justice system might be like. And it helped me to manage my expectations at that time. Access to information is a very big part of what is needed following a homicide, and trying to do this while being engulfed in trauma and stress can be so overwhelming and can be beyond the ability of those bereaved by homicide. This tells us that while the support of family and friends is extremely important and should never be discounted. Following a homicide, much more is required to support the family and friends of the victim. And this is where organisations like Advic fit in. Advic was set up by a group of families bereaved by homicide. It was set up in 2005 because we recognised the level of information and support that was needed was not readily available when we were in that traumatic time. Advic provides a number of support to families, peer-to-peer support, which, as I said earlier, is very important, information and signposting to areas of the criminal justice system, advocacy, and most importantly, professional counselling. As I said, the need for information is extremely important, and we found that although the information did exist, accessing it was not easy. And so we undertook to collate that information into one booklet and a website so that families of victims of homicide had easy and clear whatever information they needed. We also began to advocate for change in the criminal justice system to achieve a fairer, more balanced system for victims. We knew from our own experience and from a survey we undertook that professional specialised counselling was necessary. I recall my own experience of counselling in the very early days after my son was killed. And I only could go to this counsellor 2 or 3 times because I felt I was causing her distress when I was telling my story. So that wasn't very helpful to either of us at the time. So Advic set up a series of workshops for qualified therapists so that they would have a greater understanding of the depth of trauma someone bereaved by homicide would experience. This service has grown over the years, and we're very fortunate to have a highly qualified counselling coordinator who works with the families and with the therapists to ensure that this service is run on a professional and compassionate basis. Just prior to the pandemic last year, we commenced counselling for children, specialised counselling for children bereaved by homicide. And we're amazed at how quickly the demand for this service is growing. It's a vital service to help children to cope with their loss and help them rebuild a life after the sudden traumatic loss of a loved family member. Of course, COVID has meant counselling is now taking place online. And this is fine for adults, it's working out quite well. But for very young children, online counselling would not be appropriate. But in that case, our specially trained child therapists will offer parent coaching by telephone or online so that the parent or the primary caregiver are in a position to help their children until such time as we can all meet face to face again. The increasing number of deaths by violent assault and homicide in recent years has resulted in young children and adolescents needing this specialised support to help them manage and cope with the loss and the trauma. And we will continue to work to provide this service. Advic is run entirely by volunteers, most of whom have been bereaved by homicide themselves. And we provide our counselling service free of charge. We have no paid staff. We do receive some funding from government, but of course it's never enough. We rely quite heavily on the generosity of families who make donations and fundraising to keep our counselling service running.
Joan, excuse me, you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The current pandemic has impacted our ability to fundraise, but we are determined to keep going, as we know from our own experience and from the feedback we get from families that this counselling is an essential service. And it is certainly a support we're committed to providing. Organisations like Advic and Victim Support Europe understand very well the level and nature of the support needed by victims of crime. And in providing that support, they become de facto family. Thank you.
Joan, thank you so much for that speech. I think it reminds us especially about why the framework is so important, because we're here and you're here to talk a little bit about the social network, but also about your own personal resilience, but also about the interconnecting web of support that was necessary to help you to move forward, and how you became part of that support yourself. And really this knowledge that peer-to-peer support is part of a new form of a family, but we have to understand the limitations of what our families can do. And really within the framework, it's to understand that there are ways in which we can help families, communities and others to be part of the solution, but there are also organizations that have to be there where the families aren't there for the support themselves. So thank you, Joan, for that presentation. We move on now to another aspect of that social support network, which is the community itself. And I have the pleasure to introduce now Sylvia Bisconti. She is she's a doctor and a psychologist and psychotherapist who specialized in cognitive behavioral therapy and in counseling. And she is working currently in the on-the-road Societe Cooperativa Sociale, which coordinates the project Life Behind the Shelter in Italy, and that helps ensure that victims of trafficking have a positive and long-term integration. So Sylvia will talk a little bit about her work and about the importance of the community in supporting victims. Thank you, Sylvia. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So before starting, I would like to introduce our organization. So On the Road was born from the work of volunteers on a street called Bonifica of the Tronto at the beginning of the 90s to fight the phenomenon of trafficking and sexual exploitation. Over time, On the Road has established partnerships at a national and international level through European projects and participation in international platforms. And along with the other anti-trafficking organization, it has participated from the very beginning to the definition of the Italian anti-trafficking system based on Article 18 of the Legislative Decree 286 of the 1998. On the Road has also participated in the draft of the first national plan against exploitation and trafficking in 2016, and today it participates in drafting the second national anti-trafficking plan. So along all this time, our organization has extended its work with respect to our original mission. So since 2000, On the Road has been coordinating projects in 3 regions of Italy for victims of human trafficking and sexual or lab exploitation. Then it has been coordinating and running a shelter for refugees and asylum seekers for women with minors. Then it has been managing services to fight domestic violence. Today we have 3 anti-violence centers in the areas of Ascoli Piceno and Fermo, and 2 shelters. Since 2010, it opened a center, Train the V, in the Pescara train station with the goal of helping homeless people, including migrants, exploited in banking, regular jobs, or illegal activities. And it is also involved in projects to fight labor exploitation in agriculture. So basically, On the Road is involved in all projects supporting women and men and transgender people, both adults and children, under conditions of high vulnerability as being victims of violence, discrimination, and social exclusion. So one of the main goals of our organization is helping our victims to become independent and more included in our society. The community offers a great opportunity for our victims to understand the social system, the culture, the identity of the host country. Nowadays, the community offers the support to our victims through the work of volunteers, which provide a range of services. For example, they improve communication and computer skills, or they provide recreational activities that allow our victims to understand better our culture. Some sport clubs offer the opportunity to our victims to access their program for free. In some situations, the community contributes to fight crime, reporting the cases of violence directly to our organization. And also the community participated to sensitization program through social networks or participated directly to the events. Then our organization offers the victim to start a work experience as a stage that allow the victims to experiment themselves in the job, but also to interact with the people of the community. From these experiences, community learns to deal with different cultures, and our victims become able to show themselves not as victims, but as people learning a job. Anyway, there is still a lot of work to do in order to involve more the community and let people know about our programs. So a large part of the population still doesn't know about the origin of the human trafficking and exploitation. And regarding to this, they show anger, shame, and misunderstanding. They prefer to focus on the image of the city that such phenomenon can provide outside, while others prefer to ignore the problem, thinking that it doesn't exist. So I'm going to show some short selection of a video that has been published around 3 years ago by The Guardian regarding the phenomenon of human trafficking and exploitation in the Bonifica of the Tronto. And this video was created in cooperation with On the Road and reports what people think about this phenomenon.
La bonifica dove c'è la prostituzione. Per noi che viviamo qui è normale. Ci hanno portato a pensare che questa fosse la normalità. Però quella è una cosa che mi fa rabbia. Non abbiamo nessun potere, quindi chi ce l'ha non ce l'ha neanche. Non ce l'ha neanche.
Road Bonifica, it consists of factories, and there are also houses where people are living. At the end of the road, you also have the seaside town. So it's a road with normal life.
Poi prima mica era così, Adesso perché si è riempito. Donne di colore, pieno. Partono la mattina, si mettono un bancale di legno sulla testa. Significa che 24 ore su 24 adesso. Una volta di giorno non vedevi nessuno. Nessuno. Sai quante aziende hanno chiuso qua? Tante ne hanno chiuse di aziende, tante. Come fai? Che immagine dai come ditta, no?
So at this point, I would like to introduce an European project called the Life Beyond the Shelter that we are currently running to favor positive long-term integration of victims of third country national victims of trafficking in the host society. So we are running this project with other organizations from Belgium, Germany, and Spain. During this project, we have created a report after having interviewed 54 clients and conducted focus groups with social workers, psychologists, and other professionals with the goal of assess and describe the needs of the victims. After that, we have created 8 independent living skills training curriculum to offer clients everyday life guidance on topics such as budgeting, household management, self-care, safety, job hunting, house hunting. And then all this information has been delivered, and we are currently delivering that through independent living skill workshops. We have a dedicated telephone helpline that has been created for clients transitioning to independent living. And in Belgium, there is a transition house that the colleagues from Belgium are testing with some clients living in the shelter together with local tenants for around 1 year. And then there is a part of a project that is called Buddy Program. And I would like to focus on this Buddy Program because it's the phase of the project involving the community. So Buddy Program, it consists in a non-judgmental relationship in which a more experienced individual, like a mentor, voluntarily gives time to support, encourage a less experienced person, like a mentee. And the mentors are individuals who share some common characteristics with the mentees. They can have the same experiences or attributes. They may have the same age, origin, language, or interest. They can be locals, or they can be ex-victims already integrated in the society. And the role of the mentors covers 4 primary tasks. The first one is establishing a positive relationship with the mentee, building trust and mutual respect. Also maintaining regular contacts and interaction with the mentee. Another goal is helping to develop life skills. For example, mentors work with a mentee to practice for a job, help, for example, the mentee to practice for a job interview, to find an apartment, to operate an online banking account. And then another goal is increasing the mentee's ability for effective interaction in the host community. For example, they provide different perspectives, or they practice it with assertive communication styles. And also the mentors can provide awareness of the community and the economic resources that are available, and they can explain how to access these resources.
Sylvia, you have 5 minutes left.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so the Buddy Program is an ongoing activity that in Italy we started since January. We have 6 mentees, 2 males and 4 females, victims of lab or sex exploitation, and they are matched with 6 mentors. 3 of them are ex-victims of lab or sex exploitation, and 3 of them are locals living and working in the area. The program includes different stages to build this new relationship. During the contemplation stage, the mentor or the mentee consider the possibility to enter in the program. They learn about the terms and the conditions, and then they make the decision. Then there is the initiation stage, in which the volunteer coordinator selects the mentors and proceed with providing induction and orientation to the mentor before they are matched with the mentee. And after that, there is the stage of the growth and maintenance, in which the mentors and mentees start to know each other, to find similar interests, to discuss expectations, and to start to form this bond. Because of the COVID restriction, during the first part of this program, the mentees were performing online activities. Some of them were practicing with the Italian language, others they were speaking about Italian recipes and restaurants available in the area. Some mentors supported mentees to navigate website of the public administration. And instead, now that mentors and mentees can meet each other, mentors started to support them in scheduling some visits in the hospital, or for example, some visit to rent the apartments. And then there is a volunteer coordinator that perform periodic check-in with the mentors and the mentees to determine the progress of the relationship. Approaching to the end of the program, the volunteer coordinator schedule meetings to collect the feedbacks and prepare the departing of the mentor and mentees. Although the body program is still running, this is a structural activity that we think can provide support to our victims to jump from a relationship with social workers to new relationship outside the organization. And this is a true relationship in which they can share experience, learning new abilities, and include people in the society. But the program offers also the opportunity for the locals to know our programs, and at the same time, it helps to increase understanding and appreciation of cultural diversity in all the people involved. Even though victims are supported by psychologists to process the trauma they have experienced, sometimes clients have difficulty to see themselves differently by a victim within the organization. And this activity is allowing the clients to show themselves for their qualities and resources and move forward from their past. They can start thinking about their future outside the organization, and at the same time, without feeling the loneliness that they usually experiment at the end of the program, with no one taking care of them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I think what you've demonstrated there is, first of all, the importance of having these different approaches, and certainly when it comes to the community, the innovative approaches you've taken, bringing in different kinds of communities, from sports clubs to mentoring and buddy programs. I think we see that not only do the victims benefit, but the communities themselves benefit as well. You talk about the changing perceptions, but what we also know about the neurology of the brain and of human beings is that we as individuals, we grow and we find fulfillment by helping others. So I think that's a perfect example of that. Thank you so much, Sylvia. So in this last session, we're actually going over to Germany now, where we can learn a bit more about generic victim support, which is something which has been part of the foundation of Victim Support Europe, which we push as absolutely critical to the success of a victim support framework. So I'm going to welcome now Bianca Beaver, who's been in charge of Weisering's operational business since 2013. And before that, she had an extensive career, gaining professional experience as a lawyer in Great Britain, the USA, and in Zagreb and in Sarajevo after the Balkan Wars. And next to this, she's also worked in a leading position for the German Chamber of Industry and Commerce, the umbrella organization of the Chamber of Industries and Commerce, the IHKS. That's difficult to say for me. I'll hand over to you, Bianca. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Levin, for your nice welcome words. A warm welcome to everybody from Germany, from my part, and thank you to all of you who gave a very intense and also partly emotional insight to us till now. Yeah, I'm going to talk 15 minutes about the development of a generic support service, about the German service, victim support. We as Weisering are 45 years old, so we are like the old aunt in between of family now, but we try to combine our experience of our age with keeping youthful thinking. So I'm going to talk about setting up the generic service, what we had to do at the beginning, about delivering, and now the phase we are now in at developing and evolving our services. Let me start with setting up our services. We have had 17 men and women in 1976 who came up with this idea. And as we heard today earlier on, also in Germany, in this time of in this year, the side of victims wasn't relevant at all. So it was also for us in Germany a very new area. And the idea of those 17 founders was to create the first victim support organization in Germany. And so we had this origin of our organization in Mainz, which is close to Frankfurt. Our founder, the main founder, was a very prominent German television man, and our head station of television is in Mainz. Until this very moment, there was no victim support awareness or service structure at all. So the goal of our founders has been to offering face-to-face services for all victims all over Germany within reach of around about 50 kilometers. Of course, at the beginning, the main challenges, what have they been? To create a social attitude towards victims, because as you said earlier, as it has been in Germany, there was no victims perception, there was a great skepticism. So the founders had to create a new atmosphere towards the topic victims support. We have the federal system, the federal structure in Germany with every region, so it makes everything pretty complicated if you want to build something nationwide. So our founders had to think about how to get into the regions and how to have acquisition of manpower and funding. And the main point to get people to make the acquisition of manpower and funding is, first of all, of course, of creating awareness. And so by all this, building up a well-known and trustworthy brand. So how did they do this? I mean, it was a classical sales and distribution work. Our founders were very well-known people in Germany. They had very high-level jobs till then. So they used their own fame, their own trustworthiness to create a brand, Weißer Ring, to create trust in this. So with enormous network throughout all Germany, they spread out the idea and contacted members of their own social network. It was an intense work in lobbying for the victims' perspective in society, the basis for success in all other areas. Another very intense work to do is acquisition of volunteers. Also in this period, what changed during the days in Germany, fortunately, but there it was difficult to find volunteers, though they needed to give them some added value, which is for Weißer Ring education, developing social life within the organization to communicate joy of doing something significant. This was something our founders had to transport, to communicate, and using all these tools of marketing, including, and this is important, spending money you don't yet have at the beginning, but it's necessary. So delivering service, they managed to build this in a very short time of period to deliver, to be able, as Weißer Ring, as an organization, to deliver services throughout whole Germany. Within several years, we managed to make the acquisition of 3,000 male and female volunteers. During the time till now, we had the possibility to have about 120 full-time employees in Mainz and in country branches working. And we work as Weißer Ring in about 400 branch offices throughout all Germany. So this goal to be in reach, like about 50 kilometers of the victims, is pretty well delivered. We have our own structure in every region of Germany. So done this, what are the challenges when you get this level of organization, of growth? We have new challenges regarding what our founders had. We had the problem, or the challenge, to have a quick growth. It was a very quick delivered job they did, so we were growing very fast. We had at high level a lot of volunteers working. So the problem or the challenge is to keep the organization as a unit. You have to grow in a healthy way and staying a unit. The next challenge is to keep up a high standard education and knowledge within all local branches. Because if you can imagine having all volunteers spread all over Germany in 400 branches, all very not centralistic organized, but decentralistic organized. It's a challenge to keep up the level of knowledge in every region you get, to make no difference for the victims where they are looking for help. A challenge is to organize a very working quality manage and to communicate within the organization, because as fast as you grow, as more complex and complicated regulations and the world is getting, we are experiencing a total overload of information and of written information for our volunteers. We have an increasing regulation, complexity and professionalization within a volunteer-based organization, and this is our core. We are still totally, our help, our support is volunteer-based. And another challenge, getting bigger and well-known and being the only nationwide victim support organization, we had to deal with increasing competition, which was questioning this outstanding role of VSE in an increasing way. The next challenge is keeping funds on a consistent level. So what are the solutions being in this phase of just delivering and having built up a bigger organization as we are? A very important solution for challenge or for replying to these challenges, the main maybe is to really have a good intern face-to-face communications on a very frequent level in every region. I think one of the main problems really and the main issues and challenges is to have a good communication system and having the balance between necessary information but not overloading. So focusing, the next very important thing we as VSE keep a high eye on it, is focusing on a high level education, which is modern, practically, highly updated and low threshold. Because again, we are dealing with volunteers and we have to deliver a good service that it's creating the additional value. Learning how to communicate in a very focused and concentrated way is something we as full-time members in Mainz are having to learn, that we come to the point. And another important solution for the challenge is to survey the own internal bureaucracy on a very regular basis, to get rid of the unnecessary, to increase the importance of the necessary. It's something you get used to. Getting older, you have to get used to think, well, that's the way we've always done it. And it's very important to rethink the necessity and the right way if it's done in a good way. And always keeping also as a solution the awareness of the heart of the organization, which are our volunteers. This makes the organization unique. And so it's very important in between our concurrence with other organizations not to compare with organizations who have a different structure. We need to focus on what makes us different and unique. And regarding or looking into the developing, having said, how do I solve the challenges we have in the service, in delivering service, we also, of course, have to look how to develop services in the future. And this is a bit what I said in starting, like being the old aunt, but trying really hard to having a youthful mind, because being an old organization, it's very important, but also challenging to reconsider the way we deliver our support. So developing services is our self-conception of VSE is to stay consistent, reliable and high quality standards, to stay focused on our origin and keeping up with the ludicrous development of crime itself, for example, just looking at cybercrime, but also keeping up with the whole evolvement and changing society, work and life itself, which we face towards looking at the victims, but also regarding ourselves. So looking at this development, what are the challenges from my point of view? It's getting increasingly more complex and complicated to deliver a knowledge transfer, to really focus on the quick changing settings we have to work in. it's also a huge challenge, especially in a volunteer-based organization, to keep up with the technical development. We as an organization have to keep up, we have to change, we have to deliver services which are asked and searched for by our victims, and we have also to keep up with all this development. And we have to stay innovative and creative, building up new services, for example, online virtual reality, help apps, etc. We need to stay in touch with the needs of victims and society, even being the top dog. This position, being the only organization, can be lost within a blink of an eye. And I think we also, as an older organization, are doing very well, never forgetting that this is something you have to earn and always repeatedly to work for. And another challenge is to keep focused on our unique selling point. We are not, it's important not getting lost in all the opportunities in providing services, because, for example, we have like 1,400 organizations in Germany with the most complex, difficult, and diverse help of victims, but we are the only one having this nationwide generic service, and we have to keep in mind to be there. So, talking about the challenges, of course, what are the solutions as far as we as Weißer Ring see them? I think it's very important to work on the diversity within volunteers and employees. I think keeping up with the diversity, we will be able to keep up with the complexity and the whole changing society and the evolving society around us. I'm very, very convinced that networking with the best one in the field we are working is and developing together is also key and issue to success for everybody. So I'm a huge fan of networking and putting organization together. This is Helga is there too. This is something Helga as Vice President of Weißer Ring always was putting us thrive also. And I'm very convinced having this complex world around us, just putting ourselves together like we do in VSE is one of the main solutions for the challenges. So we never should fear competition, because the future can only manage in a good way together. Also, maybe because of being an older organization, questioning every service and the way of delivering is key to innovation. This sounds very natural, but I can assure you, the more you get on, the more you are used to having services for maybe 10, 20, 30 years, it's getting more difficult to questioning those services, but it's very important and key for development and evolution of the organization. And again, one of the main solutions at all is education. The organization must be a learning one, and so must every member in it. And I think this is the value, added value for everybody of us, but also for victims outside who are in need for help. Thank you.
Bianca, thank you so much for that. I think you've given us a huge amount to think about, even more to discuss. I know, working with some of our older organisations, some of the larger organisations, Victim Support Netherlands, England, Scotland, you're all going through transition periods and have equally had to rethink what your business is and how to bring the most of it. So thank you so much for giving us those thoughts. And I think it's such an important time now with respect to the direction and movement of the European Union, the Council of Europe and the UN as well. So thank you for that presentation. We've come to the end of this first day. I won't hold you up very long. It's 5 o'clock already. So I will just give some short concluding remarks. We return tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for another half day of extremely interesting presentations, which continues to explore the idea of the national framework for victim support. Today, we were really lucky to hear from João, from Wendy, and from Kasia, 3 leaders in their own rights in their own sectors, and really they're hearing about the importance of support to victims, but also how victims are part of the solution as advocates themselves, and how victims are survivors and are powerful as well, and that victim is not a weak word but a strong word in my opinion. But we also heard from Kasia and from the European Commission about their commitment. This is an extremely important moment, not just in the European Union, where we are evaluating the EU Victims Directive and other European legislation on victims, but at the Council of Europe level, where they're looking at a new recommendation, and at the UN level, where they're working on model provisions on victims of terrorism. These are critical moments. So coming together and talking about what it means to deliver support, hearing from each other about how to do that, it enables us to work with our governments and with our stakeholders as well. So we've heard here about the innovation that's required, the relationships and community that's needed, the impact and the networks, and the ability to evaluate what we are doing as organisations and where we need to go in the future. And we also heard later on from a whole host of speakers around the different aspects of the framework for victim support, the requirement to have these independent bodies who are able to keep pushing government, keep amplifying the voice of victims, but how just as important it is to help victims themselves to have the resilience, the internal resilience, and to help the families of victims be the support that they can be, understanding that there are limitations to that, which is why we need to have also the generic support services, the specialist support services, specializations within all of these organizations. But we also have opportunities to enable communities to be part of the solution. And this is just the start. There are many other aspects to this. I think going right back to Dame Helen Reeves and her presentation right at the beginning, and the early origins of victim support, and hearing also from Fatima and from others, the wide variety of people who started off victim support organizations who cared, and that's really what it's about. You see that there are people in need, that there are people suffering, and no matter what sector you're in, no matter what job you're in, you know that you can make a difference, and you come together as a group, as a family of victim support workers, really to achieve that change. So we've heard a lot today from all of those people. You are professionals and volunteers, paid people. Volunteers are professionals as well, as even though they're not paid. You've all come together to really make a huge difference. And I think just to conclude, João, our president, has really embodied that in the work he has done for Victim Support Europe over these many years, but also for APAV over in Portugal. So we're truly grateful to João for his leadership, for his expertise and his knowledge. I'm truly grateful to all of the speakers today, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow at 10 a.m. Brussels time, Belgium time, where we'll continue this discussion, and hopefully for the coming months and years. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Good evening.